The wind carried death across the Wyoming plains, and Matto could smell it before he saw the smoke rising from the settler's cabin. 27 summers had taught him that white tears meant nothing, that their screams were justice, that their blood was payment for stolen land. But when he heard the small voice calling, "Mama died," something ancient and terrible shifted in his chest, like a mountain deciding to crumble. The morning sun painted the grasslands gold, but Matto saw only the color of old blood in the light. His horse moved beneath him like a shadow, hooves silent against the earth that had drunk too much sorrow. The war paint on his chest felt heavy today, each line a promise his father had carved into his soul, with stories of betrayal and massacre. 27 winters had passed since his birth, and everyone had been spent learning to hate the pale faces who came like locusts to devour the sacred ground. His grandfather's voice echoed in the wind, speaking of treaties broken like dry bones, of buffalo herds slaughtered for sport, of children who would never again run free across the endless plains. The rifle across his back was more than a weapon. It was inheritance, legacy, the weight of his people's rage made manifest in steel and wood. The smoke rose thin and black against the morning sky, a funeral pyre that should have brought him satisfaction. Another settler's cabin burned, another family of invaders driven back to whatever hell had spawned them. His war party had struck at dawn, swift and merciless as winter wolves, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. The screams had been brief, the resistance pathetic, the justice swift and clean. This was the way of things, the natural order restored, the balance that his people had maintained for generations beyond counting. Yet something felt different today, something that made his stomach twist like a snake in his belly. The wind carried more than smoke. It carried a sound that made his trained warrior's heart stumble in its rhythm, a sound that had no place in the aftermath of righteous vengeance. He should have ridden away with the others, should have let the flames consume everything and returned to camp with scalps and stories of victory. But the sound pulled him back, drew him like a moth to flame, like a man walking toward his own execution. His horse resisted, sensing something wrong in the air, something that made even the animals nervous. The other warriors had vanished into the morning mist, their work complete, their honor satisfied, their duty to the ancestors fulfilled. They would feast tonight and sing songs of the old ways, of the time when the white man knew his place and feared the thunder of unshod hooves. But Matto remained, frozen between duty and something else, something that had no name in his language, something that felt like betrayal of everything he had been taught to believe. The cabin was a skeleton of charred wood and broken dreams, its windows like empty eye sockets staring accusingly at the sky. Smoke still curled from the ruins, carrying the scent of burned hopes and shattered lives. This was supposed to be beautiful, this destruction, this return of stolen land to its rightful owners. His father had taught him to see beauty in the ashes of the enemy, to find peace in the silence that followed their screams. The white man was a disease, a plague upon the earth, and fire was the only cure. Every cabin burned was a prayer answered. Every settler driven away was a step toward the world his ancestors had known. Yet as he stared at the smoking ruins, Matto felt only emptiness, a hollow ache that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with something dying inside his chest. The sound came again, clearer now, cutting through the morning air like a blade through flesh. It was not the cry of a wounded animal or the whisper of wind through burned timber. It was human, small, broken, the sound of innocence confronting a world that had suddenly become too large and too cruel. Matto's hand moved instinctively to his knife, his body responding to 27 years of training, 27 years of being taught that the only good white was a dead white. But his heart, that treacherous organ that had never learned to hate properly, began to beat with a rhythm that felt like drums, calling him to a different kind of war. The sound was getting closer, Or perhaps he was moving toward it, drawn by something stronger than duty, stronger than the voices of his ancestors, stronger than the weight of inherited rage. When he saw her, the world stopped turning, the wind stopped blowing, and time itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would come next. She was small, impossibly small, a fragment of humanity barely tall enough to reach his horse's belly. Her dress was torn and stained with soot and tears, her face streaked with dirt and grief, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that only children know. She stood in the ruins of what had been her home, surrounded by the ashes of what had been her life, calling for a mother who would never answer again. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the smoking wasteland of his people's justice, Matto felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been holding his world together for 27 years, something that would never be whole again. The child's voice cut through the morning silence like a prayer spoken in a language he had never learned, but somehow understood. "Mama died," she whispered, the words falling from her lips like drops of blood from a fresh wound. Her small hands clutched at the air, where comfort should have been, where arms should have wrapped around her and promised that everything would be all right. But there was nothing, only smoke and ash, and the terrible weight of sudden orphanhood pressing down on shoulders too small to bear such burden. Matto sat frozen on his horse, watching this fragment of humanity stand among the ruins of his people's vengeance, and felt the carefully constructed walls of his hatred begin to crumble like ancient stone. This was not supposed to happen, this moment of recognition, this crack in the armor of his certainty. His father's voice echoed in his memory, harsh and unforgiving as winter wind. "They are not like us, my son. They do not feel as we feel, do not love as we love, do not grieve as we grieve. They are empty vessels, hollow shells that walk upright but have no souls." But looking at this child, at the way her small body shook with sobs that seemed too large for her frame, Matto saw something that made his father's words taste like poison in his mouth. He saw grief, pure and raw and utterly human, the same grief he had felt when his own mother had been taken by the white man's diseases, the same grief that had carved hollow spaces in his chest that had never quite healed. The child's tears were not different from his tears. Her pain not different from his pain, her loss not different from the losses that had shaped him into the weapon he had become. The war paint on his chest felt like a lie now, each line a betrayal of something deeper than tribal loyalty, something that connected all living things in their capacity to suffer and to love. He had been taught that the white man was incapable of true emotion, that their tears were manipulation, their love a weakness to be exploited. But this child's grief was as real as his own heartbeat, as honest as the morning sun, as pure as the snow that crowned the distant mountains. She was not performing for an audience, not trying to win sympathy or mercy. She was simply a small human being confronting the end of her world, and her sorrow was so complete, so devastating, that it seemed to pull the very air from his lungs. How many times had he stood as she stood now, small and lost and calling for someone who would never come? His horse shifted beneath him, sensing his confusion, his sudden uncertainty. The animal had been trained for war, bred for battle, taught to charge without hesitation into the heart of conflict. But now it stood still as stone, as if it too understood that this moment required a different kind of courage, a different kind of strength. The child looked up at him with eyes that held no hatred, no fear of him as an enemy, only the desperate hope that perhaps this tall figure on horseback might have answers to questions too terrible for a 7-year-old mind to comprehend. She did not see a warrior painted for battle, did not see the enemy who had destroyed her family. She saw only another human being in a world that had suddenly become empty of everything that mattered. "Mama died," she said again, the words a litany of loss, a prayer to gods who seemed to have stopped listening. Her small hand reached toward him, not in supplication, but in the simple human need for connection, for the touch of another living soul in a universe that had become cold and vast and utterly indifferent to her suffering. Matto felt his own hand moving before his mind could stop it, felt himself leaning down from his horse's back, felt the careful distance between enemy and enemy beginning to collapse. This was madness. This moment of weakness, this betrayal of everything he had been raised to believe. His ancestors would curse him, his father would disown him, his people would cast him out like a diseased animal. But the child's hand was so small, so fragile, so desperately in need of warmth. When their fingers touched, the world changed forever, shifted on its axis, rearranged itself around this single point of contact between two souls, who should have been enemies but were, in this moment, simply two beings who understood loss. Her hand was cold, trembling, sticky with tears and soot, and the residue of a life that had ended in flames. His hand was warm, steady, marked with calluses from years of holding weapons and reins and the tools of war. But in that touch, all the differences fell away, all the hatred and history and inherited rage became meaningless in the face of one simple truth. She was a child, and she was alone, and he was the only one who could choose to stay or to ride away and leave her to die among the ashes of her former life. The sun climbed higher in the sky, indifferent to the drama playing out below, indifferent to the moment when a warrior's heart broke open and let in the light that would transform everything he thought he knew about himself and his world. The horse moved like a ghost through the canyon shadows, carrying its unlikely burden toward an uncertain dawn. Matto felt the child's small body pressed against his back, her breathing shallow and uneven, each exhale a reminder of the choice that had shattered everything he believed about himself. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but beneath it lingered something else, the metallic taste of blood and the acrid smell of burned dreams. He had crossed a line drawn in the sand by generations of his people, and there would be no returning to the man he had been just hours before. The path ahead stretched into darkness, but for the first time in his life, Matto found himself moving towards something rather than away from it. Emily stirred against his shoulder, her small fingers clutching at the leather of his vest with the desperate grip of someone who had learned too young that everything solid could crumble without warning. She whispered words he couldn't understand. Fragments of prayers her mother had taught her, mixed with the broken syllables of a child's grief. Matto's jaw tightened as he recognized the sound. It was the same keening cry he had heard from his own people when the soldiers came, when the promises written on paper dissolved like morning mist. The irony cut deep. Here was a white child mourning the same losses that had shaped his hatred, and her tears tasted of the same salt that had dried on his own cheeks years ago. The canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of some ancient beast, carved by water and time into shapes that seemed to watch their passage with stone eyes. Matto had ridden this path countless times, always as a hunter, always with blood on his mind and vengeance in his heart. Now the familiar landmarks felt foreign, as if the landscape itself had shifted to accommodate the transformation taking place within him. The old Matto would have seen these rocks as cover for an ambush, these shadows as places to hide before striking, but the man who rode now saw them as shelter for something precious, something that needed protection rather than destruction. A coyote called from the ridge above, its voice lonely and wild, and Emily's grip tightened reflexively. Matto found himself speaking to her in the soft tones his grandmother had once used with him, words in his own language that carried the weight of comfort, even if she couldn't understand their meaning. The sound of his voice seemed to calm her, and he realized with a start that he was humming, an old lullaby his mother had sung before the world taught him that tenderness was weakness. The melody rose and fell with the rhythm of the horse's hooves, weaving itself into the night air like a prayer for forgiveness. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had guided his ancestors across these lands for generations beyond counting. But tonight they seemed to shine with a different light, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would become of this warrior who had chosen mercy over vengeance. Matto thought of his father's words, spoken with the authority of bitter experience. The white man's heart is stone, and stone cannot be changed. Yet here in his arms was proof that hearts could be broken and mended, that innocence could survive even in the midst of hatred's harvest. As the first pale hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Matto felt the weight of his decision settle into his bones like winter cold. He had saved one child, but in doing so, he had become something his people would no longer recognize. A traitor to the cause that had given his life meaning, a man without a tribe, carrying the enemy's daughter toward an uncertain future that stretched before them both like an unwritten story. Dawn broke over the Wyoming wilderness like a wound in the sky, bleeding red and gold across the endless expanse of sage and stone. Matto had ridden through the night, putting distance between himself and the smoking ruins of the settlement, but he knew that distance meant nothing when the real pursuit would come from within his own people. The child had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, her small body limp against his back, and in that stillness he could hear the sound of his own exile beginning, the whisper of wind through grass that would no longer welcome him home. Every hoofbeat carried him further from the man he had been, deeper into a territory where the old rules no longer applied, and the new ones had yet to be written. The horse picked its way carefully down a rocky slope toward a hidden valley where a thin stream cut through the earth like a silver scar. Matto had discovered this place years ago during a vision quest, when he was still young enough to believe that the spirits spoke only to those who deserved their guidance. Now it would serve as sanctuary for a different kind of seeking, not the warrior's quest for power and purpose, but the desperate search for a way to keep one small life from being extinguished by the hatred that had already consumed so much. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was bringing a white child to a place his people considered sacred, violating every boundary that had been carved into his soul since birth. Emily woke as they reached the stream's edge, her blue eyes wide and unfocused, with the particular confusion of a child who has slept in strange arms and awakened to find the world transformed. She looked up at Matto's face, and he saw her trying to reconcile the gentleness in his touch with everything she had been taught about his kind. Fear flickered across her features like candlelight in wind, but beneath it was something else, a recognition that this man had chosen to save rather than destroy, even when destruction would have been easier. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to hurt me?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke, carrying the weight of every story told around settler campfires about the savages who lived beyond the edges of civilization. Matto dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, as if sudden gestures might shatter the fragile trust beginning to form between them. He knelt beside the stream and cupped water in his hands, drinking deeply before offering the same to Emily. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward to drink from his palms, her small lips barely touching his skin. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it nearly broke him. This child trusting him with her thirst when his people had spent generations poisoning the wells of her kind. As she drank, he found himself studying her face, seeing not the enemy he had been taught to hate, but simply a small person trying to survive in a world that had suddenly become too large and too dangerous. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the valley in all its hidden beauty. Wildflowers dotted the meadow like scattered jewels, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its liquid song. Emily sat beside the stream, her bare feet dangling in the cool water, and for a moment she almost looked like any child at play. But Matto could see the shadows in her eyes, the way she startled at every sound, the careful way she held herself as if expecting the next blow to fall. He recognized the signs because he had worn them himself once, in the days after his own family was scattered to the winds by men who looked like this child's father. As the day wore on, Matto found himself caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He could not return to his people carrying this burden of mercy, could not explain why he had chosen to save what they would see as the seed of their own destruction. But neither could he simply abandon Emily to the wilderness, leaving her to die alone, as so many of his own people had died. The choice he had made in that moment of her crying had bound them together in ways that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and tribe, creating a new kind of kinship forged not in blood, but in the simple recognition of shared humanity. 3 days passed in the hidden valley like pages torn from a book of sorrows, each one teaching Matto and Emily a new word in the language they were creating together, a vocabulary built not from the harsh consonants of hatred, but from the soft syllables of survival and the tentative grammar of trust. Emily had stopped flinching when he moved too quickly, had begun to eat the berries he gathered without fear of poison, had even smiled once when a butterfly landed on her outstretched finger. But Matto could see that the real healing would take longer than a season, longer perhaps than a lifetime, because some wounds cut deeper than flesh and bone, carving themselves into the very architecture of the soul. The child spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of a world that had taught her too early that safety was an illusion and love a luxury she could no longer afford. She told him about her mother's hands, how they had smelled of bread and lavender, how they had braided her hair each morning with the patience of someone who believed tomorrow would always come. She spoke of her father's laugh, deep and rumbling like distant thunder, and how he had promised to build her a swing from the old oak tree behind their cabin, a promise that would now remain forever unfulfilled. Each memory she shared was like a small gift, precious and fragile, and Matto found himself guarding them as carefully as he had once guarded his people's sacred stories. In return, he began to teach her the things that would keep her alive in this harsh country, how to read the sky for signs of weather, how to find water by following the flight of birds, how to move through the wilderness without leaving tracks that would betray her presence to those who might wish her harm. But more than survival skills, he found himself sharing something deeper, the stories his grandmother had told him about the time before the hatred, when all people were simply human beings trying to make their way beneath the same vast sky. Emily listened with the intensity of someone who had learned that stories might be all that remained when everything else was taken away. The nights were the hardest, when the darkness brought back the memories that daylight helped her forget. She would wake crying, calling for her mother in a voice that broke like glass against the silence of the valley. Matto would sit beside her, not touching. He had learned that touch could sometimes feel like a trap to someone who had lost everything, but simply being present, a solid warmth in the cold night. Sometimes he would sing the old songs, his voice rough and untrained, but carrying the weight of generations who had also known loss, who had also had to find ways to keep living when living seemed impossible. On the 4th morning, Emily woke before dawn and found Matto sitting by the dying embers of their fire, staring into the distance with the look of a man wrestling with invisible demons. She approached him quietly, her small feet making no sound on the soft earth, and for the first time since he had taken her hand, she reached out to touch him, just her small palm pressed against his shoulder, a gesture so simple and yet so profound that it nearly undid him completely. "You're sad too," she said, and in those 3 words was a recognition that transcended every boundary that had been built between their peoples. She had seen past the surface of his strength to the grief that lived beneath, had understood that he too was carrying losses that could not be spoken aloud. The sun rose over the valley one more time, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility, and Matto knew that their time in this sanctuary was ending. Soon they would have to venture back into the larger world, where the old hatred still held sway, and their unlikely bond would be tested by forces neither of them could control. But something had been born in these few days together, something that had the power to transform not just their own lives, but the very nature of the conflict that had brought them together. As Emily took his hand and they walked toward the stream to begin another day, Matto felt the first stirrings of something he had thought lost forever. Hope that the future might be different from the past, that love might prove stronger than the legacy of hatred that had shaped them both.